Thank you, Professor Rajaram, for having us here today for this discussion. You have written a wonderful book, Sarasvati River and the Vedic Civilization, among a lot others. And it is our good fortune that you have given us this opportunity to discuss your work. And so with this, I would like to start by asking you a few questions on your book, the Sarasvati River and the Vedic Civilization. I read it a couple of times in the last few months, and I thought for the benefit of the larger, greater audience who are not probably aware of this, to bring it to the mass audience, for them to know more about ancient Indian history. So with this, what I wanted to ask you is the significance of the river, as a discovery of the river Sarasvati to ancient Indian history, and what ramifications it has as we go along.
I think it has impacted in two different ways. First and foremost, it confirmed the existence of the Sarasvati River, which had been treated as mythical and imagination, had no basis and all that. So immediately we saw that the Vedic literature was talking about real things. Before that, they said it is all symbolic poetry. It is a lot of symbolic poetry, but then they dismissed the Sarasvati River and references to the ocean and all that. And at the same time, it changed the methodology of approach to Vedic history and the Vedic civilization. Because prior to the Sarasvati River discovery by Wakankar primarily, and then by others, essentially we had different interpretations of literature and language theories and all that. So essentially, although Indology or the study of the Vedas started in India with the study of Sanskrit, gradually the study moved away from India. They wanted to make their own land, that is Eurasia, Europe, and these people wanted to say that the civilization and the Vedic idea and the Vedic thought started there, and it was brought here by the Aryans. But with the discovery of the Sarasvati River, the focus again shifted to India. That's a very important thing. And second, the methodology of using only language theories and the literature changed. We didn't see it immediately. It took us a while, almost 15, 20 years or more, to recognize that now it was no longer a study of literature by linguistic scholars, but it was now a multidisciplinary study by people like me who come from a scientific background, and these people, as well as geologists. And another closely related thing is that formerly, you see, the Vedic literature was seen as sort of interpolations and all that, but now we know very clearly that very great care has been taken to ensure that the integrity of the Vedas is preserved for all time. So if there are astronomical statements there which contradict old theories, we cannot dismiss them because they have been preserved. So in our study of ancient India, we must accept once and for all the highest priorities for the Vedic literature, because that has suffered no interpolation. The Rig Veda is 100% the way it is today as it was 5,000 years ago. So you must produce absolutely overwhelming evidence to cast any doubts on the authenticity of the Vedas. So if the astronomical records or references in the Vedas take us to 4000 BC or earlier, we must accept it. And then if the description of the rivers and the oceans tell us something, you cannot dismiss it because they have been preserved with very great accuracy. You may question statements in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and all that because there are interpolations, we know that. The Mahabharata itself says it went through 3 recensions, from Vyasa to Vaishampayana to his pupil Lomaharshana, who recorded it. We know that. There is no such thing in the Vedas. Okay? So that is an extremely important thing.
One more, because you raised a very interesting point about Vedas preserving every bit of detail about India's
at that time.
and the Vedas have allude to Saraswati in many occasions. How does this basically again affect the fact that Saraswati was not a mythical river? It has been discovered now.
Correct.
And the civilization, the ancient civilizational ruins that were found there have a significant impact on the Vedic history of India and the way it demolishes the Aryan invasion theory.
Yeah, the Aryan invasion theory demolition, of course, came to be realized more or less soon, more or less immediately, because they found that the Saraswati River had dried up around, now we know roughly between 2200 and 1900 BC, but in gradual phases because it changed its course several times. North Indian rivers do that. And also it showed us that the Harappan and the Vedic civilization were one and the same. And the Harappan, by which I mean the archaeology of Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and these, what we call the Indus Valley, which is not quite correct. It doesn't matter, Harappa is convenient. It's a convenient term. You can use it both as an adjective and as a verb, and as a noun. So it essentially was the closing stage of the Vedic civilization, late Vedic. So I think I have frequently referred to it as the twilight of the Vedic age.
Yeah.
So the Vedic age ended with the disintegration of the Harappan civilization. That is what. No invasion, nothing of the sort. I mean, there were internal battles and wars and all those kinds of things like the Mahabharata war and all that. But that did not cause a civilizational change. The breakdown of the ecology due to the drying up of Saraswati caused it. And if it dried up between 2200 and 1900 BC, two things were noticed. First, this Aryan invasion theory postulated that the invasion took place after 1500 BC. Then they could not be praising a river that had dried up 500 years earlier.
Absolutely.
You see, that is one thing. Second, we find that Harappan settlements on the dried up bed of the Saraswati River. That means by the time the Harappan settlement came, the Saraswati had already dried up, the old Saraswati.
The parts of it had
Parts of it, the old Saraswati, because the channel changed,
yeah.
Okay, had dried up. That means the Saraswati that the Rigveda praises came long before the Harappan civilization, the land-based Harappan civilization. So it reversed the chronological relationship between the Vedic and the Harappan civilizations. Please note, I'm using the Harappan, the word Harappan in a generic sense to mean the civilization defined by the archaeology of the Indus, Saraswati, and that valleys. And the Vedic we refer to the literary description found in the literature. So essentially, this gave us an equation, which I later confirmed or supported with the help of the Shubha Sutras and other relationship to Babylonian and Egyptian mathematics and all that. Essentially, the equation is that the archaeology of the Harappan civilization represents the material side of the culture and civilization described in the Vedic literature. The two are one and the same. Chronological relationship is different. The Vedic literature begins with the Rigveda and the Samhitas, that is the Yajur and the Sama and all that. And then you go into the Vedanta period, which includes the Sutra and all those things. Sutra, Brahmana and all that. So, the Samhita or the Rigveda, Yajurveda period comes somewhat earlier than the beginning of the archaeology. Because prior to that, you see, before the Saraswati discovery and all that, we had a complete separation.
Absolutely.
People said there was no connection between the literature of the Vedas or the archaeology of the Harappan civilization. This is absurd. It is like saying that the computer revolution that we are living in, there is no connection between hardware and software. That doesn't happen. But the climate was such. So you see, it comes back to what I have been saying, that the Saraswati River discovery should not be seen in isolation. Apart from demolishing, or at least beginning of the end of the Aryan invasion myth, it also changed the direction of research, so that you must look at literature and the material evidence jointly and not separately. I think that's very important.
One interesting point that I want you to pay attention, or for the readers or for the listeners, and the viewers is, you mentioned about the Sarasvati drying up, parts of it drying up and changing course, so, and also about the Vedic people. First, I would like you to shed some light about who were these Vedic people. Who are these Vedic people that we hear so much about?
You see, we have to be a little careful in talking about the Vedic people than any other people. You know, we use the term proto-historic, prehistoric, but people living at the time, they didn't call themselves prehistoric or proto-historic people. Similarly, we refer to people as the, what you call Stone Age. But they didn't see themselves, call themselves Stone Age people.
Absolutely.
So the Vedic people also essentially were people who were created the vast body of literature and the associated disciplines of the relating to the Vedas, with the Vedic language, the Vedic thought, their beliefs, and the same thing is reflected in Harappan archaeology. The symbolism of Harappan archaeology comes from the later Vedic period. So, especially the Upanishads, the Sutras, Brahmanas and all that is what we see in the symbolism. And that is what Ja and I found in our deciphered script also. Okay? Deciphered writings also. They're very small, but so essentially it gives us a connection between the archaeology and the literature. So Vedic people were the people who created the Vedic civilization. They are not distinguished, we don't know what language they spoke at home. They are not distinguished by appearance, they are not distinguished by their height, weight, or eye color, or anything of that, hair color, anything of that sort. Okay? Just as when we talk about Hindus today, how they are distinguished by, there is great diversity, and they are distinguished by
the culture.
By the culture. There are certain common source, that's all. So we should get away from, and an important thing to note is that the Vedic people had close ties to the ocean. That is one of the very major discoveries that has come out. The Vedic literature is predominantly, very strongly influenced by a maritime activity. It was not a land-based nomadic culture. It was a settled culture of agriculture. In fact, an argument can be made that the word Arya can be derived from the word Ru, which is also the root for agriculture. So it is possible that the Arya, which is not important in Rigveda, by the way, in the whole of the Rigveda you find it only 40 times, in 10 books of the Rigveda. So let us be careful and recognize that the Vedic people had certain cultural traits and certain spiritual values and beliefs, and did not refer to one particular people. The leadership, for example, the Panchajanya, the Bhrigus came from the west coast, and the Vasishthas and the Angirasas had a more of an eastern orientation. And there were two great centers of Vedic thought. The two great dynasties. One is the Ikshvaku dynasty, which Ayodhya and the eastern dynasty, and another one was the western, northwestern, which is the Purus, which are the Puru Bharatas.
Yes.
Okay, but they were related by marriage and other customs. And then you also had the Yadus of the west coast, who were much more, I would say, adventurous and also more rebellious. Okay, they were troublemakers. Okay, always, for example, Kartamiri, Arjuna, these people, they had to be suppressed. And Yadus had very close connection with the southern dynasties like the Ravana. Ravana, although appears as one person in the Ramayana, it is actually he had close links, that it was a dynasty. And they had taken control of Mathura in North India, and Mandata had been killed by one of those people. Mandata was an ancestor of Rama. There is a great deal of history that is still to come out. And then in addition, it was finally Shatrughna, the youngest brother of Rama, who drove the Ravana's dynasty. By then they were known as the Lavanas. Sometimes R and L are interchangeable. And they were driven out and was captured by this, what you might call a confederacy of the Kurus and the Ikshvakus. So that was the time when the Mathuras. Then later, Lavanas, these western allies, the Yadus, came and became prominent again in Mathura, in Krishna, just before Krishna was born.
Right.
So you see, there are a lot of these kinds of political connections that we see throughout Indian history. All these were Aryans. Ravana was an Aryan. In that sense, he was a Vedic person. Arya really, we can define it purely as people followers of the Vedic faith.
Right.